When the Galactic Council gathered on the capital world of Kareth Prime, the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Thousands of delegates from different planets arrived, their ships lighting up the sky like shooting stars. Each world had sent their finest, leaders, warriors, scholars, and ambassadors, all dressed in bright colors and symbols that showed their pride. The grand hall shimmered with silver light, its ceiling showing a moving image of the stars above. It was a place built to impress, to remind everyone of the power that ruled them. At the center of all this stood Emperor Valtharion, the one chosen to become the Galactic King. His armor gleamed like molten gold, and his crown was forged from crystals taken from dying suns. The crowd bowed as he entered. Cameras flashed, and the galaxy watched the ceremony live. Every move, every word, every gesture was perfectly rehearsed. The moment was meant to show unity and strength, but beneath the surface, fear filled the air. No one dared to look away or whisper out of turn. Among the sea of powerful beings, there was one quiet observer who did not belong. Captain Elias Trent, a human representative from Earth, sat in a corner seat near the back. Earth was a small planet compared to the great worlds represented there. Humans had joined the Alliance only a few years ago, and many saw them as young, inexperienced, and unimportant. Elias knew this well, yet he didn't mind. He had come not to impress, but to learn. He watched the ceremony carefully. The way the nobles bowed so deeply that their foreheads touched the floor, the way soldiers stood perfectly still with eyes filled with fear, it all made him uneasy. The galaxy had come together to celebrate a king, but what he saw looked less like celebration and more like surrender. As Valtharion raised his hand and accepted the crown, his voice echoed through the hall. He spoke of unity, loyalty, and eternal rule. His tone was cold, heavy with pride. Every alien leader in the room cheered, but their eyes told a different story, tired, empty, and obedient. Elias realized something in that moment. This was not leadership built on respect, but on control. While others saw a great empire, he saw something fragile, a system that forced silence and called it peace. He wondered what would happen if someone ever dared to speak against it. Would the galaxy listen, or would it crush that voice before it could rise? When the ceremony ended, Elias walked out onto the balcony overlooking the glowing city. Billions of lights stretched across the horizon. The empire looked unstoppable, yet somewhere deep inside, he sensed that this kind of power couldn't last forever. He didn't know it yet. But this single observation, one human among thousands, would become the seed of change. It was the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen before. And in time, they would remember this day not as the rise of a king, but as the quiet moment before a human stood taller than any crown ever could. Elias sat quietly through the long hours of ceremonies that seemed to never end. Around him, alien leaders performed their rituals with perfect timing, each movement rehearsed to show loyalty to the new emperor. The hall was filled with bright light, rich music, and shining colors, but beneath all that beauty, Elias could feel something heavy in the air, something that didn't feel right. Every time Valtharion raised his hand, hundreds of beings bowed instantly. No one dared to hesitate. No one dared to speak unless given permission. It was as if the entire room breathed only when the emperor allowed it. He noticed how every delegate smiled too carefully, laughed only when others did, and praised the king even when they didn't mean it. The words were polite, but their eyes were filled with fear. Elias could see it clearly. Fear had replaced respect. Obedience had become the only language anyone understood here, and while most saw order, Elias saw control. He took quiet notes on his small digital pad, recording everything, the structure of the council, the way decisions were made, and how power flowed like a river that only moved in one direction, always toward the throne. He didn't judge out loud, but his mind was restless. Humans were new to this galaxy, still learning how things worked, yet Elias felt that something about this unity was deeply wrong. When he spoke to other delegates during the breaks, they were polite but cautious. Some warned him gently, saying, "Be careful, human. Words travel fast here." Others simply changed the subject. No one wanted to talk about freedom, fairness, or choice. Those ideas didn't seem to exist here anymore. Everyone seemed to think that peace meant silence, and that loyalty meant never asking questions. Elias watched all of this with quiet patience. He was not angry, only curious and a little sad. Back on Earth, people argued, questioned, and even disagreed loudly, but it was because they cared. Here, no one argued. No one even tried. It was like watching a galaxy that had forgotten how to think for itself. One evening, after the 10th round of speeches, Elias walked outside the hall. The city was shining below him, full of towers and lights that touched the clouds. From above, everything looked perfect, but he had seen enough to know that perfection was only on the surface. Beneath it, millions were living under rules they didn't choose and voices they couldn't raise. He looked up at the night sky, filled with countless stars. Somewhere out there were other worlds, other beings who might still remember what freedom meant. He promised himself that he would keep watching and keep learning. He didn't know what he could do yet, one human among thousands of powerful species. But he knew one thing for sure. The galaxy didn't need more kings. It needed someone brave enough to tell the truth. The council chamber was filled with noise that day. Hundreds of delegates from across the stars gathered for what was supposed to be a routine debate. The topic was small, trade rights between two border systems. But as often happened, the discussion turned into a stage for the Emperor's pride. Valtharion sat high above everyone, his voice echoing through the hall. He spoke of order, of strength, and of how lesser worlds should learn obedience before daring to speak. Then, with a faint smile, he turned his gaze toward the lone human delegate. "And what does your little planet think?" he asked, his tone sharp with mockery. "Tell us, human, do you still argue about what's right and wrong, as if words can shape empires?" Laughter spread through the hall, soft at first, then louder as others followed the Emperor's lead. Elias didn't rise to the insult. He simply stood up, calm and steady, his expression unreadable. He waited until the laughter faded. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly through the hall. "On Earth," he said, "we learned that strength means nothing if it silences truth. Freedom, equality, and the right to question power, these are not weaknesses. They are what make peace real." The hall grew still. Every word he said felt simple, almost too simple for a galaxy built on power and hierarchy. But something about his tone, the calm honesty in it, cut through the noise of politics. For a moment, no one knew how to respond. Valtharion leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowing. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. "Freedom!" the Emperor repeated, his voice sharp. A pretty word. But chaos wears that mask. You humans speak of rights as if they feed the hungry or stop wars. Elias looked directly at him and said, "They do. Because when people are free, they stop needing kings." The hall gasped. Even the translators paused for a second before continuing his words into hundreds of alien tongues. Somewhere in the crowd, a camera turned toward Elias, then another. Within minutes, his quiet statement was being broadcast to thousands of worlds. He didn't mean to start anything. He was simply speaking what he believed. But across the Empire, beings who had long accepted silence stopped and listened. On mining moons, soldiers' quarters, and distant colonies, people replayed the clip. His words weren't grand or poetic, but they were real. As the debate ended, Valtharion dismissed him with a cold stare, but the damage, or perhaps the beginning, had already been done. Elias walked out of the chamber feeling the weight of what had happened. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't fought, yet somehow he had shaken a throne built over centuries. It was just one moment, one honest reply, but it was enough to light a spark. And once that spark spread across the stars, no power in the galaxy could ever fully put it out. The message spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Within hours, Elias's short speech was being replayed on every communication channel across the Empire. At first, it appeared as just another piece of political news, something to be forgotten by morning. But this time it was different. His words carried something that the galaxy hadn't heard in a long time: honesty. On the mining moons, tired workers paused their machines to listen. The dust-covered screens flickered with Elias's calm voice as he spoke about freedom and the right to question power. For years, these workers had lived under harsh orders, told when to eat, when to sleep, and when to breathe. But now, hearing a human speak such simple truth made them stop and think. One miner whispered, "He's right. Why do we need a throne to tell us who we are?" The others didn't answer, but they nodded silently, their eyes showing a quiet spark of agreement. In the military outposts, soldiers who once followed commands without question found themselves rewatching the same recording late at night. They had been taught that loyalty meant never doubting the crown. Yet the human's voice stayed in their minds. When people are free, they stop needing kings. Those words echoed louder than any battle order. For the first time, some soldiers began to wonder if they were defending peace or simply protecting power. On the great academy worlds, scholars and students filled their lecture halls to debate the meaning behind the speech. "Primitive ethics," the emperor had said, mocking humanity. But the scholars realized that the so-called primitive ideas were exactly what the galaxy had lost: compassion, fairness, and choice. The young students especially were drawn to it. To them, the human didn't sound like a rebel. He sounded like someone reminding them what it meant to think freely. Even in the glittering cities of the capital, whispers began to grow. Merchants, workers, and servants shared the message in secret corners. They called it the Earth Speech. Some were afraid, others were inspired. People spoke softly, afraid the Emperor's spies might be listening, but they kept sharing it anyway. Valtharion's advisors warned him that the message was spreading too fast. The Emperor watched the clip himself, and when he saw the calm human standing tall and unafraid, his anger flared. "Human insolence," he declared publicly. "These words mean nothing." But deep inside, even he knew that the message had already escaped his control. The Empire tried to silence the broadcasts, but it was too late. Every time they shut down one channel, 10 more opened. The words had taken root, not through rebellion or war, but through thought. The people began to ask questions that had no easy answers. For generations, the Empire had ruled through fear. But now, a single human's voice had given billions something stronger than fear. It had given them hope. The summons arrived without warning. One morning, as the twin suns of Careth Prime rose over the shining city, Elias received an official message from the Imperial Council. The seal of the Galactic King glowed on the screen, a symbol that demanded absolute obedience. The message was short. "You are ordered to appear before His Majesty immediately." Everyone around him told him the same thing: go, bow, apologize, and leave quietly. They warned him that no one challenged the Emperor and walked away unharmed. But Elias wasn't afraid. He had spoken the truth once, and he had seen how it awakened something across the stars. He couldn't take those words back, even if he wanted to. When he entered the royal hall, the air felt heavy. The Emperor sat on his towering throne, surrounded by guards in polished armor. His eyes glowed faintly with pride and anger. The hall was quiet except for the low hum of the energy shields that lined the walls. Every delegate who had once cheered Elias's courage now sat silently, afraid to even look at him. Valtharion leaned forward, his voice sharp and cold. "You have spread chaos across my empire," he said. "You will make a public apology and withdraw your words. Humanity is a guest in this council, not a ruler of it." Elias stood tall, his hands at his sides. "I never asked to rule," he replied softly. "I only asked a question. Why must one voice speak for all?" The Emperor's expression darkened. "You will speak the apology, or you will not speak again." Elias looked at him, calm but steady. "You can silence my voice," he said, "but not the questions I've already asked." The silence that followed was deep and tense. The guards stepped forward, ready to arrest him, but someone in the room, no one knew who, recorded the moment. The clip of Elias's words spread faster than any official broadcast. Within hours, it was being shared on hidden networks across the Empire. People replayed it again and again. His words were quiet, but they sounded braver than any weapon. "You can silence my voice, but not the questions I've already asked." Those words became a symbol. Workers painted them on walls. Soldiers wrote them on their armor. Students repeated them in secret meetings. The Emperor's order for arrest turned into the galaxy's rallying cry. On distant worlds, banners were raised, not for war, but for truth. Entire colonies refused to follow royal orders. Soldiers laid down their weapons, saying they served the people, not a throne. The empire didn't break because of battle. It began to crack because of belief. For the first time in history, unity wasn't drawn along lines of species or power, but along the simple idea that every being deserved the right to speak. And somewhere in a guarded cell, even as Elias was taken away, he smiled faintly. He had no army, no fleet, no throne, only words. But somehow, those words were now shaking the entire galaxy. The Emperor's anger spread through the galaxy like a storm. Valtharion could no longer bear hearing the human's name spoken in the streets or seeing Elias's words painted on banners. To him, the speech was not just an insult, it was rebellion. He decided that the only way to bring back control was through fear. And so he unleashed the full power of the Empire. Across the stars, his fleets moved out in perfect formation. Giant warships filled the skies of restless worlds, their engines glowing red like warning signs. The Emperor ordered strict blockades, cutting off supplies to planets that refused to swear loyalty. Entire colonies were isolated. Communication lines were shut down. The Empire's message was clear: obey or be forgotten. But something unexpected began to happen. Instead of breaking the people's spirit, these actions only made Elias's words feel truer. The harder the Emperor tried to silence them, the louder their voices grew. Citizens who had once been afraid now started helping one another in quiet acts of unity. They shared food when supplies ran low. They spread messages through secret networks. People who had never met before began to call each other brother and sister. On the military bases, soldiers began to question their orders. Many of them had seen the recording of Elias standing in the council, calm and unafraid before the Emperor. That image stayed with them. When the time came to fire on unarmed civilians, some soldiers lowered their weapons. Others removed their insignias and walked away from their posts. "We protect life," they said, "not crowns." The Emperor couldn't understand it. For centuries, fear had been enough to control the galaxy. But now, that fear was losing its power. Every act of punishment only created more rebels, not with guns, but with courage. Each planet that was punished became another example of why the human had been right all along. Valtharion's advisors tried to warn him. They told him the Empire was weakening, that people were no longer following orders blindly, but he refused to listen. He believed strength could still win. He sent more fleets, more soldiers, more threats, but with every command, more worlds began to break away. They didn't call it rebellion. They called it independence. In the capital, once filled with celebration and light, unease grew like a shadow. Merchants whispered that trade routes were collapsing. Nobles quietly moved their wealth off-world. Even within the royal court, loyalty began to fade. The Emperor ruled over more silence than support now. From his cell, Elias heard the news through a sympathetic guard. Planets were declaring freedom one after another. The human didn't smile in victory. He only sighed softly. "He still doesn't see," Elias murmured. "Every time he uses fear, he proves that freedom was what they needed all along." And just like that, the once glorious empire began to fall, not from invasion, but from truth spreading faster than any fleet could travel. Elias had been missing for weeks when the Empire finally announced his capture. The news was broadcast across every major channel, presented as a victory for the throne. "The traitor has been caught," declared the official message. But instead of fear, a strange feeling spread among the people, curiosity, even hope. They wanted to see him, to hear what he would say. The trial was held in the Grand Hall of Justice, the same place where the Emperor once crowned himself ruler of the stars. This time, there were no celebrations. The hall was filled with cameras, reporters, and citizens who had managed to slip past the guards. The Emperor ordered the trial to be broadcast live to the entire galaxy. He believed that if the human was humiliated in public, the people would lose faith in him. When Elias was brought in, he didn't look like a hero or a soldier. His uniform was simple, worn, and his hands were tied. Yet when he lifted his head, there was calm in his eyes, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've already spoken your truth. The emperor sat high above, hidden behind a wall of guards and symbols of power. The judge, carefully chosen by the throne, read out the accusations: treason, disruption, and spreading dangerous ideas. Elias listened quietly. When they finally asked if he wished to speak in his defense, he nodded once. "Yes," he said softly. The hall fell silent. He began to speak, not with anger, but with the same simple honesty that had once silenced the council. "I was called a traitor for asking why power fears questions," he said. "But I am not your enemy. I only spoke what every free being already knows, that no throne stands forever if it must crush those beneath it." The words echoed through the hall. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to pause. Then a single clap came from somewhere in the crowd, quiet, hesitant. Another followed, and then another. Within seconds, the hall was filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't loud or violent. It was steady, like the beating of a shared heart. The guards looked at each other, unsure whether to stop it. Some lowered their weapons. Others simply stood still, eyes fixed on Elias. The judge shouted for silence, but no one listened. The trial had changed. It was no longer a performance. It had become a moment of truth. On distant worlds, people watching the broadcast cheered. In the mines, on the ships, in the colonies. Everyone saw it happen. They saw a human stand tall, not with weapons or armies, but with words that could no longer be silenced. The emperor ordered the broadcast cut, but it was too late. The recording spread faster than light. That moment, the human standing calm and fearless before power, became the spark that the galaxy had been waiting for. The revolution didn't begin with a battle cry. It began with quiet courage, and in that silence, freedom finally found its voice. The fall of the throne didn't happen in a single day. It came quietly at first, through hesitation, through questions, through small acts of courage that slowly grew into something unstoppable. After Elias's trial was broadcast across the stars, people began to see the truth with their own eyes. The human who had been called a traitor stood taller than any king, and the empire's strength suddenly looked weaker than ever. Within weeks, the royal fleet started to change. Whole divisions stopped answering the emperor's commands. Some captains refused to fire on unarmed civilians, while others simply shut down their weapons and opened channels of peace. Messages began to spread between ships. "We serve the people, not the throne." That phrase became a code of honor among those who could no longer bear to fight for fear. Valtharion was furious. He tried to tighten his grip, sending messages of loyalty and punishment, but every order he gave seemed to crumble before it could be carried out. Governors stopped responding. Trade worlds began to act on their own. Even his closest advisors started disappearing, some resigning, others quietly joining the movement for freedom. The empire, once united by fear, was now dividing under the weight of truth. For the first time in his long reign, the emperor felt alone. The capital, once filled with music and lights, had turned cold and silent. Streets that had once echoed with cheers now whispered the human's name instead. Murals of Elias appeared overnight on walls, painted by citizens who had never dared to dream before. The emperor ordered them to be erased, but by the next morning, 10 more would appear. When the royal fleet finally turned toward the capital, Valtharion thought they had returned to protect him. But when the ship stopped above his palace and no one came down, he understood. They hadn't come to guard the throne. They had come to end it. He fled that night. No one knows where he went. Some say he escaped to a distant system, others believe he vanished into the dark between stars. What mattered more was what he left behind. The throne stood empty in the great hall, cold and shining under the lights, a symbol of everything that had ruled the galaxy for too long. In the days that followed, the Galactic Council met again, but this time without crowns, without guards, without fear. The leaders of the free worlds gathered to write a new beginning. They dissolved the monarchy and replaced it with a new charter built on the ideals Elias had spoken: freedom, equality, and the right to question power. When the vote was complete, there were no cheers and only quiet relief. The age of kings had ended, and the age of free voices had begun. The empire that once ruled through fear was reborn through the strength of one simple truth spoken by a human who stood taller than any throne. When the war of words and ideas finally ended, the galaxy looked very different. The old throne hall stood empty, its golden walls now dull and silent. There was no king left to command, no crown left to fear. Worlds that had once obeyed now stood as equals, each finding its own voice. And at the center of it all was one man, the human who had started it not with power, but with truth. The new council gathered to decide who would lead this new beginning. They wanted someone people trusted, someone who could unite worlds without force. Every name they discussed eventually led back to one: Elias. His voice had inspired the movement, his courage had broken the chains of silence. To many, he was the natural choice to guide the future. When the council reached out to him, they expected him to accept. After all, who wouldn't want to lead a galaxy that had just been freed? But when Elias walked into the hall, there was no pride in his step, no hunger for glory in his eyes. He listened to their offer quietly and then shook his head. "I didn't fight for a new throne," he said softly. "I fought so no one would need one." The room fell silent. The leaders looked at each other, unsure how to respond. Some tried to convince him, saying that his leadership was needed, that the galaxy trusted him. But Elias only smiled faintly. "If the galaxy truly understands what we've built," he said, "then it doesn't need me to lead it. It only needs people brave enough to lead themselves." And with that, he stepped away from the spotlight. There were no celebrations, no grand farewell speeches. He simply returned to Earth, the small blue planet that had once been seen as unimportant. There, he lived quietly, far from the cameras and council meetings. He spent his days walking through forests, reading in the sun, and sometimes looking up at the stars, wondering how the worlds were doing. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, his words became part of daily life. Schools taught children about freedom and equality, quoting his simple sentences. "No throne stands forever," they said, "and no voice should ever be silenced." Statues were built, not of his face, but of open hands, symbolizing the gift he had given: choice. People often sent messages to Earth, hoping for a reply, but Elias rarely answered. He didn't want worship or fame. He believed that real change didn't need heroes. It needed ordinary people with courage. In time, he became more legend than man. But those who remembered him knew the truth. He hadn't wanted power, only peace. And in choosing to walk away from the crown, he gave the galaxy something far greater: the freedom to stand on its own. Centuries passed, and the galaxy changed in ways no one could have imagined. New cities shone on distant worlds. Space travel became routine, and hundreds of species lived side by side, not under a crown, but under shared principles of freedom and respect. Yet, even after all that time, one story was still told in every classroom, from the mining colonies on the edge of the stars to the great academies on the capital worlds. The story of a single human who dared to stand tall when everyone else bowed. Students didn't learn it as a legend, but as a lesson. Holograms showed the day when the Galactic King's throne fell, not because of war or rebellion, but because of ideas. In the archives, they played the old recording of Elias speaking during his trial. His voice, steady and calm, filled the halls. "No throne stands forever if it must crush those beneath it." Every time those words played, a quiet awe filled the room. Teachers would pause the projection and ask, what made his voice stronger? Than an army? And the students always knew the answer: truth. In history lessons, children learned how one human's courage started a ripple that became a wave. They studied how his refusal to kneel, his belief in equality, and his simple words reshaped an empire built on fear. Many species saw him not As an outsider, but as a reminder that greatness comes from conviction, not power. Across the stars, memorials stood. Not grand statues of him, but small gardens where people could sit, think, and remember why freedom mattered. Some placed stones with words like courage, honesty, and hope carved into them. Travelers from countless worlds visited these places, not to worship, but to be reminded of what one voice could do when it refused to stay silent. On Earth, the planet where it all began, schools taught children that their ancestors once changed the stars. They watched the same speeches and read the same stories that the galaxy now cherished. Many young people dreamed not of thrones or crowns, but of making a difference. Just like him. Even after so many generations, his message remained clear and timeless. He had not conquered planets or led armies. He had done something far greater. He had inspired others to see themselves as equals, capable of standing tall. The Galactic King had fallen, not because of force, but because a human had stood taller, through courage, honesty, and an unshakable belief that all beings deserve to be free. And so, in every corner of the galaxy, under different suns and skies, beings of all kinds remembered that one truth. Strength is not in domination, but in dignity. And sometimes, one voice, calm, steady, and human, can change the course of 1,000 worlds.